So let me tell you a little bit about the New Jersey Family Engagement Hub. We are a centralized information hub for educators, families, and community partners. We work with these constituencies to create collaborations and build bridges on all things family engagement. We do this by providing tools and strategies such as our in person workshops and our online virtual offerings. We also work with these constituencies to empower our youth. We need to know what our youth need so that they continue to be successful both in school and out of school.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, A Strengths-Based Approach to Teaching. We're excited that you are joining us today. We would love to know a little bit about you. If you could take a moment to introduce yourself, where you're zooming in from, how old are your students or children, and what is your role that you're calling in from, a parent or an educator? So we'll take a minute to share our introductions. Okay, and we're going to go on and we're going to introduce ourselves now. So my name is Erica Brenton. And I have been in education for over 20 years now. I started my career as a New York City public school teacher. I became very invested in social emotional learning, which is areas like emotional intelligence and self-control and behavioral support. And I decided that I wanted to be a social emotional learning specialist, which is what I do now. And I'm here representing SEL 4NJ. I am calling in from Montclair, New Jersey, with where I live with my family. I have two children, a middle school child and an elementary school child. So this work is hits home professionally, but also very personally. So I'm going to hand it over to my co-host for today, Megan Kimpton, who's going to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. As Erica said, I am Megan Kimpton. I am currently in Seattle, Washington. I am the head of school for a small independent school out here, but I have worked in education for over 25 years in all different sectors, public, independent, charter. I've done a lot of nonprofit work. I also have two children, one in middle school, one in elementary school, who I attempt to use all of my great educational knowledge on to raise them into strong, independent women.
Okay. So we're going to open up today by having a reflection. And what I'd like you to do is think about a teacher that you've had in your life who saw something in you before you saw it in yourself. What did they notice, and how did that change you? And while you're thinking about it, I'm going to give an example for myself. I was a high school senior and had had a fairly okay education with English and reading and writing. But I had an English teacher who really took a very special interest in me and would just seek me out to talk to me about books and to talk to me about authors, and it just made me feel very special and important in a way that I started to love reading, and it really cultivated a lifelong interest for me. So I don't know what he saw in me or if he saw that I was struggling and maybe just needed a little extra attention and support, but it really made all the world's difference to me. So thinking about your own experience, and the idea here is that, most of us remember our favorite teachers, not because they ignored our struggles, but we remember them because they saw something beyond these struggles. And today, what we're going to do is we are going to explore how we can intentionally become that teacher. And I know a lot of parents will be watching this too, or that parent for our own children. Oops. So, what does it even mean to look at strengths? Well, looking at strengths means that we are intentionally looking for and building upon a student's existing abilities and interest and positive qualities while recognizing that every student also has areas for growth. So, it really means asking questions like, What is this child good at? What helps them succeed? What strengths can we build upon? So it's not necessarily ignoring what needs they have or areas that they're struggling in, but really how we can support them to build upon their strengths so that they can continue to grow and develop. So our objectives for today are we are going to shift or think about shifting our thinking from what is called deficit thinking, and we'll review that in a little bit, to a strengths-based thinking approach. We will think about strengths that we can use or identify strengths in our own children and our own students. We'll think about how we can use these strengths to increase areas like motivation and regulation and just overall success. We'll think about those challenging behaviors that we often feel and see with our kids, with our children if we're parents, or students if we're teachers. And we'll think about how we can reframe those in a more strengths-based approach. And then we'll think about really creating routines that help every child feel and student feel capable. So we're going to provide you with actual tangible strategies that you can use. Before we actually talk about strengths, let's acknowledge the reality that many educators and parents face today. So it is really easy as a teacher and as a parent to look at the things that aren't working, right? Because we're so caught up in the moment with lots of behaviors and all the things we need to think about. So it can make it really easy to focus on what's not working. So our attention might go to areas like, if we're a teacher, unfinished work or disruptive behavior. Maybe our students are lacking skills, and those are the first things we notice. Or maybe there's poor grades, they're not achieving in the way that we want them to. There could be peer conflict or just general conflict, and there can be disengagement. So I'm curious for you, what occupies most of your energy? For me, I know that when my kids come home from school, I often focus on their grades. And if their grades are good, then I have a strengths-based thinking approach. If their grades are not good, I automatically go to, okay, well, that's not good. Like, why don't you have a good grade? And I kind of forget about all those other areas. So that tendency to do that isn't because we're negative people. It's really because that's how our brains are wired. So we really, and maybe a lot of you know this, we have something as humans called a negativity bias. And that is the way our brains have evolved to notice problems before positives. And so in a classroom, that might sound something like who's off task or who's behind or who's just not getting it. And as a parent, that could sound something like, what's wrong with my child? Or why won't they listen? Or why won't they behave? And when we constantly scan for problems, um, it could really begin to shape how we see children. So this is where we're going to talk about a deficit lens versus strengths lens. So when we're thinking in a deficit lens, and I would say thinking about not only children, but really just having a deficit lens in general, we could ask questions like, what's wrong or what's missing? Why won't they? How do I fix them? If we are looking in a strengths lens, we might ask questions along the lines of, what is working? What's strong? What is getting in the way? And how do I build on strengths? I think this is one of the hardest parts about having or shifting our way of thinking is that because we have this negativity bias, we kind of all automatically go to that deficit lens. So we need tools to really help us think about how do we look at things from a strengths lens. I have a couple of ideas from when I was a teacher and things that I do at home with my children that I'm going to share. But maybe you can also think about something that helps you to think about things in a more positive, strengths-based approach. And Megan, I don't know if you have any examples to share, but please feel free to interrupt me at any point. But when I was a teacher, something I used to do is I used to wear like 5 rubber bands on my left wrist. And every time I made a positive comment to a child, or I noticed or I recognized something in them that was something that had to do with their strength, I would move the rubber band from my left wrist to my right wrist. And so that really held me accountable, but it also helped me to share with my students what I saw in them, and they really benefited from that too. Something else that I used to do as a teacher is I used to send home every time I caught my students doing something, positive or something that reflected some kind of strength. I would send a positive note home and I would just scribble really, really quickly because, as a teacher, you're dealing with a bajillion things all day. And I would put it in my students' mailbox. And the parents just told me years and years after that they would keep those positive notes home. And it just was so meaningful to them.
Similarly, Erica,
Oh,
when I was a teacher, I sent home a folder every Friday, and in that I had pre-made for the first semester and the second semester a sheet for every student that just had a box and a date, and every week I would just write a quick one sentence that was only positive about something that I had seen or noticed the student do positively over the week or based on some of their goals. That's also something with my own kids at the dinner table. We often try and pick out first, good things from the day and then, talking about other parts of their day, but always trying to focus on what are some positive things that we've all noticed to help sort of move our brains and rewire them a bit away from that negativity bias.
yeah, that's such a good example. And I was also going to share as a parent. Another thing we do at the dinner table, it sounds like this is something you do too. Once a week, we have something called a family meeting. And it's where we talk about important things in our family and, we have an agenda. But before we get started on that, we have what's called compliments and appreciations. And everybody goes around the table and has to give the other family members a compliment or something they appreciate about them. So it's, both reflecting on themselves, but also really noticing strengths and positives about each other. Thanks, Megan, for sharing. Okay. So let's think for a moment about it could be a student if you're calling in or, sorry, zooming in as a teacher, or your own child that you're maybe having difficulty with or just want to think about. So I want you to think about three strengths that come to mind about this child. So if you would are open to putting those three strengths in the chat box, we would love to hear from you. And I will also share, I was thinking about, I have a 9-year-old and I was thinking about his strengths and I wrote down funny and athletic and smart. And it was nice to do that because sometimes I get very caught up in thinking about all the things that are driving me a little crazy as a parent. But I really enjoy doing that. So anything that you can put into the chat that you think about a child. Okay, so we have persistent and energetic and positive. That's wonderful. I'd like to meet that child. We have outspoken and curious and loud. It's funny. Um, Thank you all so much for sharing. So thinking about, why we know that strengths matter, right? Doing this activity even reminds us like it's really important to recognize the strengths that strengths in our children. But more than just feeling good and knowing that it's important, there's actual research that shows that students thrive when they feel seen and competent and valued and connected. And on the other side of that, when educators are noticing or parents are noticing strengths, motivation increases, resilience grows, relationships improve, and students are more willing to take on risks. So these are actual research-based facts that show that when we focus on strengths, look at all of these really positive outcomes. So the question then becomes, okay, if we know that strengths matter and we know it's important, what exactly counts as a strength? Well, if we're in the world of teaching, we can often fall into the trap of looking just at grades, right? Because in a lot of ways, in a lot of schools, that's what we're measured by. So if children are doing well on tests, then we're doing well as a teacher. But how can we open ourselves up to look at more than just grades? Well, if we are thinking about in an academic context, we have areas like curiosity or persistence. We have social areas. So, how empathetic is a child? Are they funny? Do they show strong leadership skills? There's the emotional part of being a child or being a human, really. So, we can look at areas like optimism and self-awareness and resilience. And then we have behavioral. So, is this child responsible? And how flexible are they? Do they put effort into their work? Is there a certain, amount of independence that they're able to use? So even if they aren't doing well on their math test, maybe they can work really well independently or they're really responsible. And so when things become very much about numbers, how can we, as parents and educators, think about making sure that we're holding these other areas of strengths to high levels of importance? So I'm just curious, what are some of the areas, and just good to reflect on, that you notice the most? Are you focused mostly on academic, or do you sometimes focus on emotional, social, or behavioral? And what are some of those areas that you overlook and what could be strengthened? So thinking for a minute about that. And while you're thinking about that, the thing also that I wanted to mention is that sometimes strengths are actually hidden beneath challenging behaviors. So it takes a lot of digging and combing through to really think about, okay, how can I overlook this challenging behavior that's right in front of me, kind of like I did with, or we all did with the children that we wrote 3 words about, who's really giving me a hard time or isn't listening, and how can I create some space within that so I can really think about what strengths are there. So let's talk about challenging behaviors, because when we have a challenging student or a challenging child, a lot of times we can ask the question, well, what's wrong with this student, or what's wrong with this child? And if we think about reframing that a little bit into, well, what need or strength might be underneath this behavior, it could really help us shift from that deficit way of thinking to that strengths-based approach. So just some examples, and then I have a couple of examples of my own children. A lot of times when we have talkative children, well, how could we think about this child as a socially confident child? Or maybe you have a child that's really argumentative, but they also have a really strong sense of fairness. Maybe they'll be a lawyer one day. A lot of children I have taught, I was a first grade teacher and a second grade teacher, and a lot of children I taught were like very restless and so needed to move a lot. And so it would sometimes be hard for me to get through a lesson, but when I would reframe that and say, okay, they have a lot of energy, we need a movement break. That would be not only beneficial to me, but it would be so beneficial to them. Or maybe we have a perfectionist child who is just very highly conscientious. So I keep bringing up my 9-year-old. He is somebody who asks a lot for things. So he comes home from school or camp and he'll say, can I have this for dessert? Can you call this friend for me? Can I have this toy? I want this. And to be honest, it drives my husband crazy because he finds it to be hard to listen to and wants to break the him of that behavior. And so in my mind, I find him to be like very determined and very persistent. And so he wants what he wants and he's going to ask for it. And he doesn't get what he wants most of the time. So it's not like we're, spoiling him, or sometimes, we might, but it's mostly that that behavior is showing that he's very, very determined. And that helps me to look at him in a more positive way. And it actually helps our relationship a lot too. So when we think about how we can shift our thinking from what's wrong to, what strength is underneath or what need is underneath, it could really help us change the way that we look at a child and respond to a child. So instead of thinking a child, let's say, is lazy, and I would say actually that this is for children, but it's also just for humans in general, right? Maybe we work with somebody that we are like, that person is lazy, but if we could look at them and maybe think, well, maybe they're overwhelmed. Um, Instead of thinking a child is defiant, maybe they need more autonomy. I will very much, and Megan, maybe you have the same experience where I have a teenager, and defiant is the word I use very often to describe him. And it was really great to work on this presentation because I have to remind myself in that negativity bias kind of way that he really just needs independence and he needs autonomy. He needs to be able to make his own decisions and he needs to be able to express himself in different ways. And that's a really helpful shift for me to recognize in him. If we have a child, let's say, who's attention seeking, most often they just really want connection with their peers or with an adult, whatever it is. Maybe you have a child who feels or seems unmotivated, but maybe they've experienced too many failures and they just don't believe that success is possible. And maybe we have a child who is showing disrespect. And we can say they're disrespectful, but they may also be missing some really key skills. And we're going to talk about those skills in a moment. Um, Now, these are not necessarily to excuse behavior, and especially if there's misbehavior, but really to show what could be happening below the surface.
Erica, as you're talking, I keep thinking about a quote I heard recently, which is every complaint is a request. And
Mm,
if you think about the behavior a little bit as somewhat of a complaint, you can also think about it as a request in these reframes. So, you know, a a student or a child who is defiant is really telling you that they need some more autonomy, that usually the behavior is out there to meet some kind of need. And so if you can reframe for yourself and sort of ask the question, what are they asking for? That can really help again that negativity bias reframe for
I love
yourself.
that. I'm going to use that
Yes, not
often.
that it's always easy, but
No,
it does
but
sometimes help you also get out of the loop of feeling constant frustration with those patterns of behavior,
yes.
like the questioning that you mentioned for your younger.
Yes, I love that. But can you say that one more time? Every
Every complaint is
complaint
a request.
is a request. Okay. I'm going to write that down. Thank you, Megan. When we talked a bit about um, lack of skills, and again, this really makes me think again of my teenager. Um, there's times where when I think of him and I think, okay, oh, Alexis, thank you for putting that in the chat. Lazy or difficult or disrespectful. What I really am noticing is that he actually is missing in skills, and children could be lacking in key skills like emotional regulation, excuse me, executive functioning skills like organization or prioritization or task completion, or maybe they're lacking in some kind of communication skills, flexibility or problem solving. Um, my son, as he has become more steeped into his own technology, we got him a phone this year, and And the way he talks to his friends over text messaging is a way that he started to talk to us, his own family. And there were times where I would say that's he's being really disrespectful. But actually, I think what I started to realize about him is that he was lacking in key skills of how do you actually talk to somebody when you're 13 years old. We're not your friends, we are your family. And so here are proper ways that you need to communicate with us. And we would give him those tools. We would say, when you answer us, here are some ways you can answer us, and actually had to teach him that. And once he recognized that we had a different expectation of him and we taught him those skills, he was much more able to, and I'm not saying he's not disrespectful, but he was much more able to meet those expectations. So I'm going to hand this over to Megan because Megan is going to now share with us, now that we've identified these strengths, how we can actually use them. So, Megan, I'm going to hand it on over to you.
Great. So we've been talking a little bit about how to sort of reframe your thinking, and that can really be articulated in the way that you talk to children in your life, whether that be students or your own children, is to really be objective and explicit about what you are seeing, especially when you're trying to reinforce those positive behaviors. So using sentence stems like you see here to really call out, I noticed that you took a brave step today and tried something new. I noticed that you tried to answer that question by yourself. I appreciate that you took no for an answer, which is one of our sort of behaviors that we try to reframe around boundary pushing with my teenager and negotiation, which is really her showing her strong self-advocacy skills. So using some really clear language to help point out those positive strengths to your own children or students also helps them register when they're doing the things from a strengths point of view. And so this is something that became actually a really important passion of mine as a teacher, is really thinking about the language that you use with your students. And that so often, especially when we're moving quickly, oftentimes when we are trying to point out positive behavior and strengths, we use very vague language. And so when you can be really specific about exactly what the positive behavior was, just like I said, so something like good job, which they don't really know what the good job was, if you can reframe that into, and I noticed you kept working even after getting frustrated, helps them know the exact piece of positive behavior that you are reinforcing. Also, when we tell kids that they're smart or nice, all of those sort of really generalized words about strengths, doesn't again give them sort of the key information to help them wire in the positive behavior. And so here are just a few more. I love the term language swap, is just really thinking strongly about how you can sort of put this in. And it's really, I think, fascinating to watch students and your own children positively react to more specific language. I know, especially with my teenager, I sometimes get in that "you're always" trap. Your clothes are always on the floor in the bathroom. You're always asking, to push a boundary that I've given you. But if you can reframe, like, hey, I noticed that all your clothes got into the hamper today. I really appreciate that. It helps, and it helps them not sort of internalize that negativity to feel as though something is wrong instead of a, specific behavior that can be changed. I think that's sometimes the danger when we focus on sort of the negative pieces is that children in our lives can start to feel like something is wrong with them instead of there's a behavior that we need to modify. And so helping them better understand that also feeds into their own growth mindset about what they can do.
Sorry.
No. Um, and I think as classroom teachers, we often use jobs in the classroom. And so looking at strengths to be able to give students specific jobs that really help them not just demonstrate to the adults, but also the other students in the classroom what their strengths are, having conversations with them about those. So structuring the jobs in your classroom to help students be able to show their different strengths. I think also differentiating is a really important way to think about how you can help students see other strengths, whether that's in how you might be assessing their work or giving them different options for doing projects, or, if they're one of Erica's energetic first graders, can they do some sort of play or movement demonstration to show that they can add things together? So really thinking through how you can have strengths be demonstrated sort of across the school day. And even at home, I think there are ways that you can also capitalize on those strengths. If you have, a child who's a perfectionist, having them bake is a great thing to do because you have to be so perfect in all of your measurements when you bake and things like that to help them demonstrate some of their strengths in the home as well. So I want you to think about, again, a child in your life, whether that's at school or at home, and think about the strengths that you notice. We even thought about that a little bit earlier. You can think about the same child or a different child. And so, thinking about those strengths, what are ways that you might be able to leverage that in the classroom or the home?
Megan, I'm thinking about my teenager and just, when he um is so excited about talking to us about his friends, or it kind of talks to us like we are his friends. And we've shared with him again that example before about how to have proper communication. He also is a very strong mentor for his younger brother, and so we've said to him, and we talk to him often about, you are your younger brother's mentor, and what you do really helps guide him. And so he's started to really embrace that and share with him, when you talk to your friends, you're not supposed to, or when you talk to your parents, you're not supposed to talk to them like your friends. And so he's using all of those strengths that he's learning to really help guide his younger brother. And it's super, super helpful for us. Oh,
Yep.
we have one in the
Yes.
chat here too.
Yeah, and so Kyrie just talking about using the persistence to try new skills at home and really encouraging that so that they are able to practice different skills. And so, sometimes kids who are really persistent can also not be persistent with other things. So helping them use their strengths in places that they might not otherwise think about is also great. Thank you for sharing those examples.
Okay.
And so here are just a few more ways that you can think about practices in your classroom, but I think they also very easily translate to the home. So really, and this is as much about training your own brain as it is training the children's brains and, challenge yourself to uh, notice strengths once a day or twice a day. I'm going to say something before we get out the door for school. I'm going to, notice a strength before lunchtime in the classroom. Sometimes having a little checklist with all of your students' names on a clipboard on your desk or in a good spot in the classroom. So you make sure you're doing that for everyone and you're doing it evenly. And then you can even say those things out loud at any moment. I love student self-reflecting and trying to get my two daughters to reflect at home as well on what's working well. What do you think you could do differently? How could we plan for this better next time to help them sort of think through those things? And often, if they're not in a moment of anxiety or pressure, thinking about moments to be able to self-reflect there at all. When I was a classroom teacher, my favorite hour of the week was our class meetings. So Erica talked a little bit about her family meetings, but we would always open those meetings with appreciations for each other. And I was very clear about what that had to be. It had to be clear, it had to be specific. And we also made it time bound. So it couldn't be like forever ago, you were a great friend. But like this week, I really appreciated it when you asked me to play a game with you on the playground and really helps them get clear about identifying those strengths in others. Thinking about the language that you're using in conferences is also really important as a teacher and trying to, balance. There are always challenges that you want to share, but also really thinking about couching that in what is working for students as well. And then um, choice opportunities in any environment for a child helps them be able to use their best strengths to demonstrate their learning or their capabilities.
Thanks, Megan. Those were also super helpful. We also have a note in the chat from Alexis. I used to mentor students with disabilities in college. Something they struggled with was comprehension of the classroom topics they were learning. So to help them, I would make sure their notes were detailed and broken down in a way they could understand. And I'm sure that that really helped them to develop their own strengths to say like, okay, when it's a nice structure and scaffold so that they can then feel that they understand the material and they can feel, positive about their own learning. So that's a great example.
And we've talked about this a few times throughout our time together today, but the more that you can help students internalize and your children at home internalize what they are good at, what they can do to help other people, how they can demonstrate their strengths, they will start to be able to articulate that to you and to their teachers and to the adults in their life so that they can start to advocate for themselves and be able to say, I'm really good at, organizing. So I would like to use this graphic organizer to help me in my writing. And so the more that they can have that language, then the more that their strengths will be internalized and used on a regular basis. And so, I think the beauty of thinking about this reframe is that you will see positive behavior changes in the children in your life. Um, it really gives them just more empowerment and greater sense of efficacy, which then increases their engagement and just helps them make faster progress, all throughout, both socially and emotionally and academically. You can really see that translate across their experience. And as a teacher and as a parent, it only improves your life too. You are able to, I find when I am thinking positively and looking for strengths, it helps me connect better to my teenager, especially. It helps with thinking through power struggles. It just helps your engagement and connection be overall stronger and more positive.
Definitely. Do I take over here, Megan, or do you do this? I forget.
I'm happy to do it.
Okay, go
So
ahead.
thinking thinking through what we have talked about here today, just giving yourself a moment to make an action-oriented commitment with the information that we have talked about. So just thinking through whether it's in your classroom, which hopefully you are on a beautiful summer vacation, so, what you might say or think about tomorrow or on that first day of school, what might you notice for a child in your life? What might you say to them? And thinking either about your classroom from last year, or if you have a sense of who will be in your classroom this upcoming year, thinking about a student who might really need those strengths highlighted to help them move forward in this new school year. And so, just to review a little bit of what we've talked about today, I really love this first check here, really challenging yourself. And as a parent and an educator, it can sometimes be hard to see that potential first. But I think both Erica and I can guarantee that when you do that, there are great positive benefits that come with that. Similarly, um, as we said before, looking at those strengths before deficits and really thinking about that as the next one is not just labeling a characteristic, but trying to build skills. And everybody's favorite line from today that every complaint is a request. So when you're seeing those negative behaviors, what are children trying to tell you, and how can you help them use a strength to get what they need? That language, when it's very specific and explicit and clearly identifies the positive behavior and demonstration of the strength, that communicates belief from you, but also helps the student know exactly what positive behavior was so they can repeat it later, which helps them, as we just talked about, seeing themselves as capable, and strengthens the child-adult relationship.
All right, thanks, Megan. That was so great. We have a Q&A open if you have any questions that you wanted to ask. Um, we're here and you will get a copy of this presentation. So you'll have our email addresses, and you'll have all the information that was in this presentation. I was just looking back through the chat and I saw that KRA had wrote something before that we didn't read. And I just thought it was so great that her old band teacher had a major influence on her She wanted to play drums like most other kids that age, but he or she helped expand Carrie towards piano, tuba, and cello. Wow. And apparently she was really good at reading music. That's so wonderful and also such a nice thing to learn about you, Carrie. So if there are no questions, we have um, just a list of resources here for you. And again, you will get this presentation if you registered for this webinar. So we have some book recommendations, The Power of Our Words, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk, The Whole Brain Child, and The Strength Switch, which are all about the topics we talked about today. We have some podcast recommendations. So these are really great if you're just needing a quick listen to in the car or on a walk, that really highlight what we spoke about here, and then some websites that you can visit for additional resources and materials. But that being said, we will just hold on for another minute. And oh, Alexis just shared there is an upcoming webinar next week. It's all about language and how language shapes growth and connection. So that's at 12 o'clock next Wednesday. I hope you can join us then. And we hope you have a fantastic afternoon. And thank you so much for spending time with us. And we'll just hang on for a minute to see if there's any other questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, for co-presenting with me. That was so
Yes,
fun.
thanks, Erica. It was great.